So this tutorial is going to show you how to create your own custom React component library that you can host on GitHub and install through npm. So some of the reasons you might like to do this are if you find yourself often creating the same kind of components over and over again, and you want to use the same components in different unrelated projects. This makes it easy to, simply run npm install and add your own custom component library to each of your different projects. So there's a few prerequisites that we'll assume before you get started with this. We're going to assume that you have your IDE ready, somewhere that you can work with your code, VS Code, for example. We're going to assume you're familiar with npm and you have it installed on your machine. We're going to assume you have some kind of terminal. We'll be using a bash terminal, but anything that can run the commands that we show, for example, here is fine. We'll assume you're at least somewhat familiar with React and TypeScript. You don't have to be an expert in either one of them. We're going to create a really, really simple component, just a button using JSX. And for TypeScript, we're just going to make a really simple interface that provides a string to the button that acts as the button's label. So even if you're not super familiar with React or TypeScript, you can still probably follow along with this tutorial just fine and kind of learn the basics as you go. So with that said, we're going to get started. So we'll start with creating the directory for the project. So I'm just going to open up my terminal here. So this is a bash terminal. Again, you can use whatever terminal you're comfortable with as long as you're able to translate the commands to your terminal. So I'm going to start by making a new directory for this project. I'm just going to call it template for a React component library. So make directory template React component library. And I'm going to change the directory into there. So that's ready to go. So now I'm going to open up this folder in VS Code. So here we are. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see better. So we have an empty project, and this is going to serve as our component library. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to initialize a new project with npm. We're going to run npm init, and we're just going to use all the defaults for now. We're going to override most of these defaults later on when we get to configuring our package JSON file. But for the time being, just hitting enter to go through all the defaults is fine. Your way through all of them. Okay. And that will, as you see here, it's created a package.json file for us with all of the defaults set up. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do for our library is we're going to create the component that we're going to be exporting. So there's a few directories that we're going to build that might seem a little bit overkill at the beginning, but you'll see later, kind of as you go and add more components, that it makes the extra work that we do here for building the library makes it easier for the people who are using our library to import the components. So we're going to start creating a directory, src, our source for all of the files that we'll have in our library. We're going to create another directory within inside src called components. And lastly, we're going to create one more directory in components that holds the component that we're going to use as an example, and we're going to call that button with a capital B. And so inside that button directory, we're going to create our first file, and we're going to create a file called button.tsx, TypeScript using JSX. So we have three folder tiers here, and each one of these is going to contain an index file that exports the component that we're working on. So that way, if we export all the way back to the source directory, whoever's using our library can simply say import button from the name of the library, and they don't have to say /components/button. So we'll start by creating the first index file in our button directory, index.ts, and that's going to export our button. Well, we haven't created the button yet, but we'll do that in a moment. So we're going to export default from button. Current directory /button. Now it doesn't recognize that because again we haven't created our button component yet. So at this point, let's go and make our button component that we're going to export with our library. So just a simple button. I'm going to copy from the example that I've already set up here, and we'll kind of show each piece one by one. So we're going to be using React, import React from React. We haven't installed it yet, so we got a little error underlined there. The button is going to take a single prop. It's going to be called label, and it's going to be a string. So this here is our TypeScript interface. So if you weren't using TypeScript, you would just leave this part out. But this defines a required prop called label that our button needs to receive in order to work properly. And lastly, we have a functional component here called button. It takes props of the type button props, which is a label, and it takes that and just creates a generic HTML button with props.label as the label for the button, and it exports it as a default module. So I'm going to save that. So now this is looking a little better. This still has an error because we don't have React in our project yet. So why don't we, at this point, install the dependencies that we're going to be using. So we're going to run npm install. So what do we have so far? We're using React and we're using TypeScript. And we also have to add the types for React because they don't come bundled with the library itself. So we're going to add React, we're going to add TypeScript, and we're going to add @types /React. And that'll give us the types for React. And this is going to be a dev dependency. So we're going to do --save -dev -dev. Hit enter and install all those. So at this point, you can see our error now from importing from React is gone, and we're good here. So the next step is we're going to export this button from the components directory as well. So we're going to create a new file inside our components directory, and it's going to be called index.ts as well. And we're going to export default as button from our button directory, which is /button. Great. So now with this basic setup, you can see how you could easily add more different components. You can add an input, and add a date picker, whatever components you want to provide with your library. You create a directory here, you export it as a default, you export that default from your index file, and then for each one of those, you're going to add another line here in your components index. And lastly, we need one more index file in our source directory, and that's just going to export everything from our components. So we're going to create index.ts. File already exists in this location. I might have clicked on components there. Let's try source index.ts. That's a little better. And this, we're just going to export everything from components. We're going to say export asterisk from components. Great. So that's looking good. That's looking good. And that's looking good. We have all of our index files set up. It's going to be easy for anyone who's using our library to import that button. And we have the button itself, which takes a single prop called label, and that places it as the text for the button. So that's the basic setup for creating the component that our library is going to export. So now, how do we bundle all of this up into a library that we can actually publish? So that's where a tool called Rollup comes into play. Now, if you're not familiar with Rollup is similar to Webpack, which you might have used before. They're both JavaScript bundlers. They take a bunch of different JavaScript files, JavaScript modules, and bundle them all together into a single file that's easier for browsers to understand. Both of them can usually do, if they're configured properly, you can do the same thing with either one of them, but Webpack in particular is good at creating single file bundles for, like a large application, where Rollup is particularly good at creating bundles for a library. So because we're building a library, we're going to use Rollup. So what we can do now at this point, before we go any further, we're going to initialize TypeScript in our project. Now, if you're just using TypeScript as in your project, it doesn't require a configuration file for simple usage. But if we're doing something, for example, like building a library, there are a number of configurations that we need to make. So we do have to initialize it to get our configuration file that we can update. So to initialize TypeScript in a project, once it's been installed, all you have to do is run npx tsc, the TypeScript command line command, and --init, and run that. And when you do that, it's going to create a tsconfig.json file, which will act as the configuration for TypeScript in your project. So if we look at it, it's really handy. Modern versions of TypeScript will give you comments for essentially every field that you can update and configure in your tsconfig file. So if you're not familiar with these, it's worth taking a look at. They even give you a little link at the top that you can go to for the documentation to learn more about what each one of them does. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit and add all the configurations that we need for TypeScript to get it to work with our library. So those values are, I'll copy them here and I'll kind of explain what each one of them does. So those are going to be these here, and you can see I got a little bit of an underline. One of them is duplicated. So by default, module is set to common.js, and that's not what we want. We want to have our library export modern ES6 modules, so we set that to ESNext. So we set module to ESNext. The second big important one is that TypeScript is not set up to process JSX by default. So if we tried to bundle our library, we would get an error saying, what is, in our button.tsx, what is this? And to fix that error, we update our tsconfig with JSX as React. So that will convert that JSX syntax into a React.createElement function call. Declarations is true, so we want to create .d.ts files, and the reason we're doing that is we want our library to be usable by anyone, whether they're using JavaScript or TypeScript. If we include .d.ts files, then it provides those types for users who are using TypeScript, but it doesn't prevent someone who's just using JavaScript from using the components that are in our library. Declaration directory, we're going to put them in a types directory, and you'll see how that comes together a little bit later. We're going to include source maps for debugging. So if we're exporting JavaScript files where the line numbers might be different from our TypeScript files, the source maps will provide some nice error handling, saying wherever the error is, it'll show the line number in the TypeScript files that you're writing, as opposed to the JavaScript files that are automatically generated. Our output directory is called dist, and that's where we're just going to bundle our library, and everything is going to go into the dist folder. Module resolution uses the node module resolution. So if you're curious what that means, you can do a Google search for node module resolution algorithms. It'll explain how node looks for modules when you say import X from Y, depending on whether you're doing absolute paths or relative paths or anything like that. How it first looks in node modules, and if it doesn't find something there, it looks in the next place and the next place. Essentially, it just says use that logic when we're running our imports. Synthetic default imports essentially means if you're not exporting something by default, it'll assume that you are. And lastly, declarations only. So Rollup is going to be the tool that we use to bundle our JavaScript files. So we don't need TypeScript to bundle JavaScript files. We can just use TypeScript to bundle the type files in our library and let Rollup take care of the actual JavaScript files. So that hopefully explains what each one of these does and why they're needed. So you'll kind of see as we go a little bit further in building the library, the use of each one of these. And if you decide to, you could comment them out and run the Rollup bundler, and you'll see as you get the errors kind of one by one. It's a nice learning experience to understand why. Oh, I see why I need to set JSX like this. I see why I need to have module resolutions this way, because it can't figure out where my modules are when I'm importing and exporting if I don't set this value in my TS config. So I'm going to save that. That's great. And then we're going to move on to Rollup itself. So what is Rollup? Rollup is a JavaScript bundler similar to Webpack. If you've used Webpack before with your projects, Webpack is very good at bundling applications together into single JavaScript files that browsers can understand, as opposed to individual modules that aren't necessarily supported. Rollup does the same thing. For the most part, you can usually get Rollup and Webpack to kind of accomplish the same goals, but by default, sort of out of the box, Webpack tends to be better at bundling a large project together into an efficient single JavaScript file, or chunks as they call them. But Rollup is particularly well suited for bundling libraries together. So that's why in this case we're using Rollup as opposed to Webpack. So with that said, the next step that we're going to do is we are going to install Rollup and configure it. So before we install Rollup, it's good to understand that, again, similar to Webpack, it doesn't necessarily know how to do everything right out of the box when you install it. It works with what's called a plugin ecosystem. So you install Rollup, and then you just install the individual plugins that you need to do whatever it is you're trying to do. So in our case, we're trying to build a library, and we're using TypeScript. So Rollup, we're going to add a few plugins in addition to Rollup itself to help understand those different file types and those different ways that we want to bundle everything. And that makes it a really efficient tool that only uses kind of the pieces and the features that it needs that you add yourself. So what we're going to add is we're going to install vim install. We need Rollup, the main tool, and then there's 4 plugins that we need. So we need a plugin called Node Resolve, which again is similar to the module resolution, which tells Rollup how to resolve each one of our imports. So that's going to be at rollup/plugin node resolve. We're going to install another one called CommonJS. So this lets us bundle our libraries together using CommonJS modules in addition to ES6 modules. So those who are using our library can choose whichever one works better for their project. So Rollup plugin CommonJS. Since we're using TypeScript, we're going to need, not surprisingly, Rollup plugin TypeScript. So that will teach Rollup how to process TS files as opposed to JS files. And lastly, in addition to processing these TypeScript files, we also want to provide the types for our library. So we need to produce files called .d.ts, which are type definition files. So that itself is a separate plugin, and it is called Rollup plugin DTS, and it doesn't have the @ symbol like all of the other plugins here that we're using. I'm not sure why, but it just doesn't. And those are all going to be dev dependencies as well. So we're going to run or add -- save dev like we did the first time. And we'll install those. And there they go. Okay, so we've added Rollup and we've added 4 plugins. So Rollup, when it runs, it's going to look for a file called, similar to how TypeScript looks for a tsconfig.json, Rollup is going to look for a file called, I'm going to create it now in the root directory of our project, rollup.config.js. It's a JavaScript file. And you'll know you spelled, if you're using VS Code, you'll know you spelled it right because it gets that little cool icon. All right, so that's created. So just to make sure that I don't make any mistakes, I'm going to copy the one that I already created here, kind of one by one, just to show what each piece of it does. So first, we're going to import all of the plugins that we installed here. And again, if you can't type along with everything that's getting pasted here, you can just clone the repo and focus on following along and kind of understanding what all of these pieces do, because that's a lot more important than just typing it all out. So we're going to import our Resolve plugin, CommonJS plugin, TypeScript, and DTS. And each of those is going to be variables, and each one of these is going to be a function that we add to our plugins array when we get to that. And then the other module that we're going to import that's very important is actually our package.json. So when we use CommonJS modules, and you'll recognize CommonJS with the require syntax, we can import JSON into a JavaScript variable. So we're going to import our package.json file here as a JavaScript variable so that we can refer to some of the different properties on our package.json. And we're going to refer to a couple of them that we haven't actually created yet. And then once we're done creating this config file, we'll add them to our package.json. So those are the modules that we need. So a rollup config exports an array of configuration objects. So it can be, if you only want to roll up and bundle one type of thing, then you only need one object. For our library, we're going to need two configuration objects. The first one's going to export the JavaScript files that has all of our components in it, and the second one is going to handle exporting the types, the .d.ts files that describe the types of our components in case whoever's using our library is using TypeScript. So what we're going to do is we're going to export default, and that's going to be an array. And for now, we're going to focus on the first configuration object, which again, I'm going to copy so I don't make any mistakes here, and we'll show kind of one by one what each piece of this does. So the input is what is the entry point for this part of our library, and that's going to be our index.ts file inside our source directory. So if we go back and look at that, what is this file? This is the file that exports all of our components. So this is what gives someone who's using our library the ability to say import button from whatever the name of our library is. And then the output is going to output two things. And this first one is CommonJS modules, CJS, which are defined by the main field on our package.json. Now we haven't done that yet. That's what we're going to do after we're done configuring this. But what file that gets exported to is defined as the main property on our package.json module. And for ES6 modules, it's going to be defined on the module property on package.json. And both of these are going to include source maps because source maps are fantastic. Okay, so next we have our plugins. So we need our node resolve plugin, and we invoke that. Each one of these is a function. Our CommonJS plugin and our TypeScript plugin. And for this one, you do specifically have to specify where the location of your TS config file is. If you don't specify that by default, it won't look for your tsconfig.json. So make sure you get this right. And we also, got a little bit ahead of myself. We'll cover how to deal with CSS a bit later on. So Resolve, CommonJS, and TypeScript. And you'll notice we're not using the DTS plugin yet. That's a separate configuration for Rollup that we're going to run as the second element in this array. So with that one complete, next we're going to copy. We're going to create a second object here, and that's going to look like this. So the input for our type files is going to be dist/esm/types/index.d.ts. And if you're not sure why this file structure is the way that it is, you'll see we've already started with defining that the types are going to be declared in a types directory, And when we edit our package.json, we'll explain that everything gets output into a dist directory. And the output is just going to go into dist/index.d.ts. So our whole component library is going to end up in the dist folder, and our type files are going to end up in index.d.ts inside that same folder. And then for plugins, similar to above here, we invoke the DTS plugin. So we're going to save that. And that's our rollup config. So as we mentioned, we're referring to a couple of values in package.json that we haven't actually edited yet. So the last thing that we do before we run rollup for the first time is we're going to update our package.json file. So we click on that, and we still have all the default values in here. So not too worried about the name, not worried about the version yet. Why don't we start with, because our library is still in development, we'll begin with version 0.0.1. Description, it's going to be a React component library. Describe it however you like. Main, we're going to update, so I'm actually going to delete main. It's not going to be index.js anymore. And scripts, tests, we don't have any tests yet, so I can delete that. And we're going to add our own script in a moment after we're done defining some of the other values. So the author, put your name in, put my own name. We've got our dependencies here. So at the bottom, I'm going to add a few new values. So again, if we look back at our rollup config, we refer to a value called main in package.json. We also refer to a value called module. So we need those two at minimum. So I'm going to add a couple extra values here. So what I'm going to add is main module and a third one called files. So the main defines where our common JS modules are going to be, dist/cjs/index.js. Module defines where ES6 modules are going to be, dist/esm/index.js. And files, this one's important, says that everything that we output is going to go into a dist directory, and this is going to be the library itself. And lastly, there's one more to add here. We're going to define where we want to output our .d.ts type files. So what that's going to be is a field called types, and it's just going to be dist/index.d.ts. And I'm going to save that. And finally, we are ready to run rollup. So what we'll do is we'll add a script here to make it easy to run rollup. So I'm going to call it rollup. Now, if you're not familiar with what scripts in package.js does, basically you can put whatever name that you want here. And when you do that, you can type npm run the name of this script, and it will do whatever terminal command that you like that you type over here. So when we run npm run rollup, it's going to run rollup with the -c flag. And what -c means is run rollup with a configuration file. And that configuration file is rollup.config.js. So I'm going to save that. And I believe that's everything. So we now should be able to go down to our terminal and run npm run the name of the script here that we just created, rollup. And hit enter. And there it goes. So as we hoped, it created this dist directory here with our common JS modules for our library, our ES6 modules for our library, and our index.d.ts types for our library. So if we look at this here, you can see that it's exporting the interface for our button and defines what types our button needs in order to work. So that's really good. So what is next? So at this point, we're ready to publish our library so that we can install it using npm, and we're going to host it on GitHub. So what I have done is I've already gone ahead onto my GitHub profile, and I've created a new repository, and I've just called it, you can call yours whatever you like. I've called mine React template React component library. You can see it here. So I haven't put any files or done anything with it yet. So what I'm going to do before I get started is I'm going to take all of the code that I've done so far and I'm going to add it to my new library. Now you can make yours, if you want, you can make yours private. What we'll be doing in this tutorial will show how to use either a private or a public library. There's just a couple extra steps that you need to do if you want to do a private library. But this one here is going to be public. So I'm going to initialize a new Git repository here on my machine. So I'm going to git init, initialize an empty Git repository here. That's great. So before I push anything to GitHub, I'm going to want to add a git ignore file. So if you're not familiar with git ignores, it starts with a period to show that it's a hidden file. Git ignore. And what I don't want to include in there's two directories I don't want to include in my repository. So node modules is automatically installed when I run npm install based on the libraries in my package.json. So I don't need to include node modules. You'll see that commonly. It's almost every git ignore file for a JavaScript project will always include node modules. And the other one that we don't need to include because we're building a library and because it's generated automatically, as you just saw, is our dist folder. So we don't need that in our repository because anyone who clones our library and uses it can just run npm run rollup and it will build the dist folder for them automatically. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to do git add dot, which just says add all the files in this project to my Git repository. Git commit -m first commit. Great. And now I'm ready to push it to the repository that I created. So if you haven't made one yet, again, just go on GitHub, create a new repository, call it whatever you like, and follow the instructions that you get automatically that shows you how to push your code to it. So in my case, it's going to be, have to add a remote origin. So I'm going to copy, paste there. And then I'm going to git push to the upstream -u origin on the master branch. Yours might be main, depending on how recent your GitHub version is. Mine's a bit older. Hit enter, and it pushes it. So I go over here and I look on my repository, and I refresh, and there's all the files that we've been working on so far. And that's great. So now I have a repository for my library. So this isn't the package itself. This isn't where you're going to be installing the package from in your other projects. This is where if you want to update your button component or if you want to add other components that your library uses, this is the repository that you would clone and you would edit. So how do you produce a package that other people can install? That's kind of the big question here, right? So move this out of the way. So what we're going to do now is we're going to publish this to our GitHub package repository. So GitHub, which is a really, really great service, allows you to publish your own packages to GitHub and install them with npm. So there's one little configuration change that we need to make in our package.json file. So we're going to open package.json. So what this needs to say is we need to edit two things. We need to edit the name of our project, and we need to add a new value that explains where we're publishing to. So the name of our project needs to be the @ symbol followed by our GitHub username / the name of the repository that we're using. So what it is, it's going to be @GitHub username / repository name. Okay. Now that'll be different for you when you're creating yours. So I'm going to go and replace it with mine. So my GitHub username here, / and I've called mine template React component library, and I'm just going to copy that to make sure I don't make any spelling errors. Paste. So that's there. So that's the name of it. And then the other value that we need to add is called publish config. So I'm going to add that down here at the bottom. We're going to add that. And that says, where are we publishing our library to? So again, as you can see, I've already copied it. Registry is going to be npm.package.github.com/your GitHub username. So mine is, again, and yours will be different. So we save that. So that defines where we're publishing to. So we should be ready to publish at this point. Now it's not going to work quite yet. The one last piece that we're missing is authorization to actually publish to our own repository. So you can see that if you kind of jump ahead and try and publish. So the publish command for npm is npm publish. npm publish. So we run that and say, oh, no, you are not authorized on this machine, So why am I not authorized? We need to create a configuration file for npm. So that configuration file is located in your home directory. So if you're on Linux or on a Mac, that's just cd tilde. If you're familiar with the shortcuts for the home directory. On Windows, that would be c/user/whatever your Windows username is. So we need to make a file in that directory called .npmrc. So I'm going to go and I'm going to do that now, and I'll show you how that file needs to be configured. So, bear with me a moment here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file using whatever method that you choose. I'm going to use nano, the command line editor, nano .npmrc. So that's the name of the configuration file. So you need whatever editor that you use or whatever way of doing it, you need to create a file called .npmrc inside your home directory. So I'm going to do that. The first line looks like this. Registry equals registry.npmjs.org. The second line looks like this. And now I'm going to copy my own. Again, this is my own GitHub username. It's going to be different for you. So again, here where I have my name, yours is going to be your GitHub username after the @ symbol, :registry, npm package github.com. And lastly, we're going to have this here. The third line is going to look like //npm package.github.com /auth token equals. And this is something that we haven't created yet. So what we need to do is we need to create an authorization token for users on certain machines to be allowed to actually publish packages to our GitHub repository. So I'm going to save this for the moment because I don't have an auth token yet. So to get an auth token, so I'm going to go back to GitHub, and I'm going to go to github.com /settings/tokens. You can get to the same location if you just go to your GitHub profile, you go open it up, you go to settings, developer settings, and then personal access tokens. What you're going to do is you're going to click on generate new token. You're going to give it a name. So I'm going to come on React component library. You're going to give it an expiration. So that's up to you. It's mostly a security thing. So if you're sharing this token with other people or you're concerned that you might forget about it, then setting an expiration means that it won't have an infinite shelf life. So GitHub gives you a big warning if you try and create a token with no expiration. That's up to you what you want to do. So for this one, I'm just going to create it with only 7 days. And the other aspect of security is that the token will allow you to make changes to your GitHub account, but only with whatever permissions that you set. So the only thing for what we're doing right now that we need to do is the ability to publish libraries. So the only permission that we need is write packages. And by default, when you say write packages, you also give permission for read packages. So we do that, and we're going to click generate token. So that will generate a token for you. It's only going to show this to you once. If you refresh the page or leave the page, this token is gone for good. So make sure that you copy it here wherever you need it. So it's going to go into our npm rc configuration file. If you use a password manager, that's a great place to have an extra copy of it in case you need it. If you're wondering why I'm showing it to you right now, this token obviously will be deleted before this video gets uploaded, but for the time being, it serves the purpose to show, kind of how it works. So I'm going to copy this token. I'm going to go back to my npm rc file, and I'm going to paste it. Paste. Doesn't want to paste. So copy again. Paste. There we go. So paste that in the auth token field. And I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to exit. So now, if I go back to my component library, remember we ran npm publish before, and it gave us an authorization error. Now that we have our npm rc file created, we should be able to publish without any error. So if I run npm publish, success. Template React component library version 0.0.1 has been published. So now our library has been published to GitHub, and we're ready to use it in other projects. So if you go to your main GitHub dashboard, you've got all your repositories. And now you can click on packages over on the upper right side, and you'll see the package that you published here, version 0.0.1, and it's ready for other people to add and install with their own projects. So now that we've published our library, what we want to do is we want to kind of put ourselves in the position of someone who's using, like a user who wants to download and install our library and use that button component that we've created. And that user can be, it can be yourself on different projects. It can be someone else who wants to use a button that you've created. So what we're going to do is we're going to now create another completely separate project and kind of pretend that we're a user in that position, and we're going to install our own library. So I'm going to create a new React project as if I was someone else who wanted to use our library. Now, the easiest way to create a React project is with a tool called Create React App, which you can run with the npx command. So npx create React app, followed by the name of the app you want. I'm just going to call it my app. And there's a number of different templates you can use. One of them is a template for TypeScript. So since we put the effort into exporting all those types, we might as well use them. So I'm going to run --template TypeScript and hit enter. And it's going to install that for me. So while that's installing, I'm going to open up another instance of VS Code, and I'm going to open up that project in a separate window. So it's done installing. So here it is. So this is the Create React App project called My App there that we created just now. So if I look here, I've got app.tsx, and in my package.json, I have a start script that starts the project. So I can run that script with npm run start, enter, and you will see that it loads up the default React app with the default app component. So that's pretty much as simple as it gets. Now, what do we do if we're a user and we want to use that cool library that we created that has a button component that we want to use? So what we do, same as you would with any other library, I'm just going to close this app for the time being. is we install it. So we do npm install. Now what are we installing? So what we're installing is the name of the application that we created. So the name was defined in our package.json. So if I reopen the package.json, I'm just going to move this kind of on the left side of the screen here and have our new. So on the left, just in case this is a bit confusing, on the left here, I have our library that we created at the beginning of this tutorial. And on the right, I have a React project that is someone who's using our library might want to install. So our library itself, the name in the package.json file is defined up here. So we take that name. Okay. Now I'm another user. I created a new React project. I heard there's a great button component that I might want to install. So I run npm install at your GitHub username / the name of the repository. And I hit enter. And it's going to install it. So this, if you created a public repository, this is going to work for anyone who goes to install your library. The only time that you might run into permission issues is if you created your library as a private repository. So what you need to do if you did that is anyone who wants to install your library from a private repository has to do the same thing that you did with the configuration file. So they need to create a .npm-rc file with the same values, and they need to have an auth token which has authorization to download packages from your GitHub account. Now, the only difference with that one is that where you would need to create and edit the library, you need to have read and write access. You could, if you wanted to be a bit more secure, you could create an additional token that only has read access and provide that to the people who you want to be able to have access to download your library. And then they would put that in their npm-rc file and they would be able to download and install your library. So now that we've done so, we've downloaded and installed that library. Now if I go into app.tsx, so the library is installed, and I know, because I'm familiar with it, that that library exports a button component. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, oh, I would love to have a button component. So I'm going to do it with a capital B, button, here. And what's really great, if I do control period, is it immediately, because I'm using TypeScript, it recognizes, hey, there's a button module in the component library that I've just installed. That sounds great. So I'm going to add that, and I still have an error. Why do I have an error? So let's take a look. Label is missing from the props. That's right, because we required it when we created the button, we said you have to have a label, and that's the label that the button's going to have. So I'll define that value. Label is equal to, let's say, hello world, and save. And now we've imported a button from our component library, and we've used it here, and we've provided that label value. So now I'm going to run npm run start and hit enter. And if everything goes well, we have down here at the bottom, below all of our styles, a hello world button that we've created. I'm going to just move that up so it's a bit more obvious. I'm going to move it inside the header here and save. There's our hello world button. So this button comes from our component library that we've exported, and we've provided a label, and our component is using it. And that's amazing. Everything is set up perfectly. It's working well. We can create our own custom components, export them, publish them, and allow other people to download and use our library through npm. So if you've ever wondered how do all these libraries work that I install and I use every day, this is it. You can do it yourself now. So now that our library works, the last kind of big piece that we would want if we're creating a component library is we want the ability to style those components. So what we didn't set up initially was a processor for CSS files. So we can add that now. So if we go back to our component library here, we open up our source directory, components, and we open up the button that we created here. We're going to now create a CSS file, and we'll learn how to bundle and include that with our Rollup library. So in the button directory, I'm going to create a new file called button.css. Enter. So this is a CSS file, and it's going to be included with this button here. So I'm going to add some styles for a button. And I'm going to say that those styles are just going to be, I'm just going to increase the font. So let's say font size is going to be 60 pixels. It's going to be a huge button. So the button that we exported here, Hello World, is going to become a massive button. So now that we've created the CSS file, what we need to do is we need to add some syntax. It's not regular JavaScript syntax, but it's a special syntax that Rollup is going to be able to understand, that will know how to bundle our CSS file and include it with this component. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to import the CSS file directly from the component. So we type import, and we're going to say current directory button.css. Now, if we just try to run Rollup at this point, we can try it right now, npm run Rollup. We're going to get an error saying, what the heck is that CSS file? I don't understand this. You need plugins, yada, yada, yada. So that's where we add the plugins to handle that. So if we go to our Rollup config file, what we're going to do is we are going to add a couple of extra lines here. We're going to add a line to import post CSS from Rollup plugin post CSS. Now, obviously, we can't import this if we don't install it. So I'm going to copy this here, and I'm going to run npm install Rollup plugin post CSS --save -dev. We're going to install that plugin. So that adds it to our, now we've imported it in our Rollup config file. Next, we need to use it. So we're going to add it to the list of plugins that run when we roll up our library here. And we invoke it. So we import it first, then we invoke it down here in the plugins directory. And lastly, if we try and run this again, I'm going to run npm run rollup, we're going to get one more error. And that error is going to come when our type files don't understand what that CSS file is. So if I run that, say, oh, don't know what's going on. Index.d.ts could not resolve button CSS. So what we need to do is we need to add one more property to our .d.ts rollup config file, and that's going to be called external. And that's going to define external files that aren't relevant when we're bundling our types. So the external files, it's going to use a regular expression, and it's going to look like this. Anything that starts with CSS and ends there, essentially any .css file isn't part of our type exports, so it can be safely ignored. So I'm going to save that. So between these three lines, import post CSS from the plugin, run the plugin, and ignore CSS files with our types. Now, when I run npm run rollup, we'll see that the rollup succeeds, and our CSS files will be included with our bundle. So if we look at our CSS here, what did we do? We did font size 60 pixels. If I open up the library that I'm just the dist folder, and I look, let's say, look at the ESM index.js. I'm going to do a Control F. I'm going to search through this file, font, and you can see that it's bundled our CSS styles in line with our JavaScript file. So that's pretty cool. Now, in order to update our library, though, if we've updated our library, but we're still running on the original version, but we've changed it, so we can't publish version 0.0.1 again because we've already published that, which didn't have any styles. So if we're going to update a new version of our library, we want to publish a different version so that it doesn't impact users that are using the original version of our library. And maybe adding CSS is a breaking change. If you want to know more about that kind of stuff, you can look up a concept, you can Google it, called semantic versioning. It kind of says that if you're going to do breaking changes, you probably want to update the major version number of your library. So say like 1.0.0, 2.0.0, etc., etc. Once you get your library up and running and people are actually using it, that's something you'll really want to pay attention to. While we're just testing, it's not that big of a deal. No one else is using our library at the moment. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to make sure that I give it a different version number here. So I'm going to give it a version number of 0.0.2, and I'm going to save that. I'm going to roll it up again as version 0.0.2. So now I've created another copy of my library called 0.0.2, and that version of it supports CSS and includes styles on our button component. So I'm going to publish that now to my GitHub repository with npm publish. Run that. That's great. So version 0.0.2 of our library is now live. So jumping back over to the React library that's actually using, React project that's actually using our library is still running. If we look at the package.json dependencies, is still running on version 0.0.1. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pop that up to 0.0.2, save it, close the application, and I'm going to run npm install again. So when I run npm install, it's going to look at my package.json. It's going to see what versions of the library that I need. It's going to see, oh, apparently now I need version 0.0.2 of the React library, and it's going to install it for me. So I hit enter, and it should install the latest version of the library that I published. That's great. So if I go to app.tx and I look, and I'm still running this button component, the API hasn't changed, which is nice. So it's not really a breaking change, I guess we can say. It still uses the same props, everything like that. It just should now have the styles, the CSS styles that we've included. So we've now exported this button to say anytime any user that uses this button is going to get a button that has a font size of 60 pixels. So instead of a little hello world button, we should get a gigantic 60 pixel size font hello world button. So let's find out if we do. So we've updated the library. Now let's run this application with npm run start. See what happens. And popped up over here. Drag it over. Whoop. There's our gigantic styled hello world button that we're now exporting, including CSS, from our React component library. And that's pretty much all you need to build your own custom library with your own custom styles. There's still a couple extra things that you probably would want to use if you were going to do this in a real world project. The first one would be tests. You know, if you building components, you want to be able to test them before you export them to make sure that they work. So in a future video, we can talk about how to add React testing library and Jest to this project so that you can test your components before you publish them. And the other is, this is a big one. If you look at right now, we're working on these components, we're creating them, we create our button, we add some styles to it, but we don't actually have a way to see how this button looks while we're working on it. So we would have a couple of options there. We could create an index.html file. We could add React DOM as a dependency so that we could attach these components to the DOM and host it like an application. But that kind of goes against the philosophy of a library if the library itself has the ability to run as an application. So one of the tools that is out there that is absolutely fantastic for handling that kind of thing is a tool called Storybook. You can look that up. Just do a Google search for React Storybook. It's basically a tool that lets you load up each of your individual components that don't necessarily, come together in an application for people who are building a library, and look at them and test them in an interactive browser environment without actually having them run as an application. So we'll do a little extra tutorial on how to add Storybook to your library so that you can test the components and make sure they work the way that you want them to before you publish them and before you export them. So you can look forward to that. So now we're going to add some tests to our library so we can test our components and make sure they work properly. So we're going to use a React testing library for testing, and we're going to use a library called Jest to run those tests. So let's install those. So we'll start. We're going to run npm install testing library, React, Jest, and the TypeScript types for Jest. So run that. Okay, while it installs, I'm going to start creating my first test file. So we'll do a test file for our button component. So inside source, components, button, I'm going to create a new file, and it's going to be called button.test.tsx. Okay, and this is where our test for our button is going to go. So using React testing library, the test for our button is just going to be a simple test to make sure that it loads and mounts on the DOM. So it's going to look like this. So we're importing React. We're importing the render method from React testing library. We're importing our button component from the same directory that we're in. And our test, simply called button, test to see if it renders the button properly. And we're just giving it a label, again, with hello world here. So a very, very simple test. This is just an example to make sure you know how to set up the project structure, the configuration, and all that. If you want to get deeper in testing and more useful tests, you can certainly read more on the documentation for React testing library. So now that we have our test, we need to create a configuration file for Jest. So we're going to create, in the root of the project directory, we're going to create a new file called jest.config.js. And in that testing file, there's just one value that we need to set at the moment, and that's to specify that we are using a package called JSDOM as our test environment. So JSDOM is a JavaScript implementation of the DOM, like a browser has, but that we can use to simulate adding components and mounting them. So with that configuration in place, we just need to add another script in our package.json to run the tests. So all you need to do is run the Jest program. So we're going to make a second script here, and we're just going to call it test. And test is just going to run Jest. So we'll save that, and we'll give it a try and see what we get. So I'm going to do npm run test, hit enter. Let's see. Okay, we got a failed test. Let's see why. It doesn't recognize the JSX syntax, so that was to be expected. So we configured Rollup with the TypeScript plugin to handle our JSX for us, but we don't have that environment set up for Jest. So what we're going to use to handle JSX with Jest is a package you might be familiar with called Babel, and particularly a Jest plugin for Babel. So what we do is we're going to install, there's a few libraries here. Babel, like Rollup, uses a lot of plugins to give it instructions on how it works. So what we're going to install the core Babel library. We're going to install the preset environment that will look at our config file and get the configuration from there. We want a Babel preset for React because we're using React, a preset for TypeScript because we're using TypeScript, and we want a package called Babel Jest, which will make sure that Jest processes our code through Babel, and that's how we'll get rid of this error on the JSX here. So we're going to install all those libraries. And now that we have Babel in our project, we need to configure it to use those presets that we installed. So I'm going to create another file called babel.config.js. And this one is going to export an object that has all the presets that we installed. So Babel preset env, Babel preset React, and Babel preset TypeScript. So I'll save that. And we'll try again, see if it works this time. npm run test. Okay, so we got another failure. Let's see what's up here. Doesn't recognize the import CSS syntax. Now again, that should be no surprise. We used a post CSS plugin for Rollup to handle that, but we don't have a configuration for Jest to explain what we mean when we say import a CSS file. So to handle that, we're going to use a library called identity object proxy. And basically what that's going to do is it's just going to proxy any file types that you choose. We'll use CSS and say you can just treat them as a generic JavaScript object. Basically don't do anything. It'll just skip over them, but it will get rid of our error, and that's the most important thing. So we install that. npm install identity object obj proxy. Hit enter. And then we just tell Rollup that we want to use that. So back in our, sorry, not Rollup, Jest. In our Jest config, we'll add one more property here called module name mapper. And what that does is it will say whenever you hit a module with a certain file name, following the pattern here, we want to use the identity object proxy to proxy that file name. So we've done CSS, and we've also added less and SCSS in case you want to add those to your component library in the future. So save that, and hopefully we'll be ready to go this time. So npm run test. Runs a button test, and look at that, we have a pass. Renders the button component. So that's how we configure Jest, and we add tests to our library. So you can configure it so that those, you can use actions or Git hooks to run your tests automatically whenever you commit, so that you make sure that everything keeps working. So the last thing that we're going to add is a library called Storybook. More than a library, Storybook is a whole basically an application that runs in your browser that lets you view and test your components and run them in all kinds of different predefined states that you've defined for them. So if you have a button, you might want to have a big button, a small button, a medium-sized button, a green button, a blue button, all the different kinds of buttons that you would use in your project, whatever you're working on. Say you wanted to build a library that provides a few different options of buttons that all go well together, and the user can pick the ones that they want. So in order to view all those buttons at the same time, doing it in the project itself isn't convenient. You might have one button on one page or two on another page, etc. So with Storybook, it lets us kind of toggle between all of those buttons and even change the different states in real time so that we can see all the different kinds of components that our library has available and test them in a little sandbox environment, so we don't have the overhead of all the rest of the application getting in the way when we're just trying to test our components. So to install Storybook, it's pretty handy that it's mostly an out-of-the-box, batteries included kind of library. We just run npx sb for Storybook, init, and hit enter, and that will no more creating, jest.config, rollup.config. Storybook, the initializer will look at our project and recognize different aspects about it. For example, the fact that we're using TypeScript, the fact that we're using React, and it will automatically install all the plugins and all the configurations and everything that it needs. So this one is much more than any of the other tools that we've used. Just hit the install button and watch it do everything for you. So after it's all done, it just says run your storybook, type npm run storybook. So before we do that, what we need to do is we need to actually create what they call a story. And a story is just an instance, an example of one possible version of your component. And you can have as many as you want. Each story represents a different version of your component. So going back to the examples that I gave before, a big button, a small button, different color buttons, each one of those is a different story, or I guess they would say a different template within your button story, and you can cycle between them. So when you install Storybook, it automatically creates this stories directory inside of your src directory. So if I open that up, we'll see that we have quite a few nice examples automatically built into the library that come with Storybook when you install it. So I'm going to use one of those as the example. So here's the story for the button that comes with Storybook. I'm just going to copy all of this, and in my button, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it button dot. So what Storybook looks for is it looks for .stories.js or ts or tsx files. .stories.tsx. And then I'm going to paste this template that I took from the stories directory and just update it to fix my button. So my button is a default export, so I'm just going to get rid of these braces here. The title, so this is where you'll find it in Storybook. All the examples will be in a directory called example. I'm just going to call it React Component Library. You can call it whatever you want to, but that's where you'll find your stories when Storybook runs. The component we're using is button. The arguments that the button takes, obviously it doesn't use background color. I'm just going to delete that for now. You can read more. You get these nice little comments with links to the documentation to understand more about what each one of these things does, which is handy. The template for the component. So you can see this is where it actually runs the button that you're importing. And then from that template, you can bind the different arguments for the different states of the component. So the primary version of our button here, you can see that the default example took a prop called primary, which our button doesn't take. Our button takes a label, but it doesn't have a primary prop, so I'm just going to delete that. And the label for our button is where we've always traditionally put hello world, so I'm going to type hello world there. And this one I'm going to call, just so I can recognize it when we open Storybook, it's not really a primary button, it's more of a hello world button. So that's what I'm going to call it, hello world. So this represents a hello world version of our button. And then you can make another version of the button. We'll call this one click me. And the arguments, the label on that is going to say click me. And then there's a few other ones here. We don't need them. 2 is enough to demonstrate how it works. So we have our story here. We've defined where in Storybook we're going to find it. And we've defined 2 different states of the button. One of them has a label of hello world. The other one has a label of click me. And now that our story is created, we should be able to just run npm run storybook. And once again, we don't have to create that script ourselves, because if you look in our package.json, Storybook automatically added these nice little scripts for you. So Storybook is going to run Storybook and host it on your machine on localhost on port 6006. So that's great for when you're working on your library, you're testing, you'll get hot reloading, all that great stuff. Build Storybook is really cool. It will output a static HTML and JavaScript directory that you can just put on your server and host it on your domain and share it with your team or anyone who might want to use your library and get an idea of what the components look like first. You can host Storybook as a website and let people use it and try out your components. So we're going to run the Storybook script here so that it hosts it on our machine and we can test it on our machine. So npm run Storybook. And we've got an error. What do we got? Okay. All these error messages. Start from the top. Cannot find module React DOM. Oh, that's because we aren't using React DOM. We haven't needed it up till now. We don't need to mount our React components on the DOM because we're not mounting them. We're just sharing them with other people. So what you can do is, presumably, once you have Storybook installed, Storybook will have React DOM as what's called a peer dependency, which means anyone who's using the library must have that dependency. And we can get peer dependencies simply by running npm install. So what this will do is it will install all the libraries that we've defined in our package.json, which should already be installed, but it will also install the peer dependencies of those libraries as well. So if Storybook requires React DOM, then running npm install should install React DOM for us. No? So if there's a peer dependency that you're missing, doing that should install it. So we know that Storybook didn't run before, but now if we try npm run Storybook, looking a little bit better this time. Yeah. And here we are. So here is Storybook running on localhost port 6006. And over here we have React component, made that a bit long, React component library, the name that we gave to our story, and under that we have our button. So if I click on this, I'll see Hello World, my giant font Hello World button, and Click Me, my giant font Click Me button. So this really, really handy tool gives us the ability to switch between different predefined component states. So particularly if you're working with a designer, this is really, really handy to be able to test and validate and troubleshoot the components that are designed for you to make sure they work the way that they're intended to work. And not only can you create different predefined versions of them, but you can actually manually change the props in real time. So I have the ability down here to update the label. Click me many times, and it will automatically update your component right away. So Storybook is a super, super, super useful feature. I highly recommend you spend some time with it. Check out the documentation. The documentation for Storybook is great. There's plenty more that it can do that I haven't even talked about, and getting to learning how to use it in your projects will got a bit of a learning curve, but overall in the long run you'll save yourself quite a bit of time just on debugging and testing, particularly when you work with a large team. It's might be a bit overkill on a project of 1 or 2 people, but once you start working with a lot of people, it really simplifies things to be able to just talk about individual components on their own without running them and testing them within the rest of your application, and getting a bit more flexibility on being able to look at them visually and make sure that they match with your designs than just using automated tests with Jest. So Storybook and Jest, go well together. One isn't better or worse or replaces the other. They really, having both of them in your arsenal is great. So I hope you learned something from that. I hope you got something to take away from this. It's a bit dense of a tutorial and a bit long. If you made it all the way through, congratulations, and good luck with your component library. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment on the blog post or the video, or reach out to me however you like. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks a lot.